They were wearing vests that boldly said HOA Security. They carried clipboards like they were carrying badges of authority. Then they told my 74-year-old grandfather that he had 10 minutes to get off land his family had hunted for more than 60 years. What they didn't know was that Grandpa had already locked every gate behind them. Before we go any further, I want to know where you're watching HOA Revenge Stories from. Drop your country in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. And if you haven't subscribed to HOA Revenge Stories yet, this is your last chance. Hit that subscribe button now, because the next story gets a whole lot crazier from here. My grandfather, Earl Whitaker, purchased 42 acres of heavily wooded ridgeland back in 1961. That was long before subdivisions started creeping toward the tree line, before paved roads replaced the old gravel paths. Back then, his property was nothing but forest, creek, wildlife, and silence. He built a small cabin there with his own hands. He taught my father how to hunt on that ridge, and years later, my father taught me the exact same way. 3 generations of our family's boot prints had worn the same trail down to the same deer stand overlooking the same bend in the creek. When the county approved a new housing development about a mile down the road 15 years ago, Grandpa didn't think much about it. Why would he? His property was properly deeded, surveyed, and legally grandfathered for agricultural and recreational use. No HOA had jurisdiction over a single square inch of his land. But paperwork means absolutely nothing to people who have already decided they want more territory. And that's exactly what happened one cold, crisp October morning during the opening week of hunting season. 2 SUVs suddenly came rolling up Grandpa's private drive. Magnetic decals on the doors proudly announced, Ridgemont Estates, HOA Patrol. They drove straight onto Grandpa's property like they owned the entire ridge. Grandpa was already sitting in the tree stand when he spotted them coming. 4 men climbed out. They were wearing tactical-style vests, sunglasses, and walkie-talkies clipped to their belts, looking like they were auditioning for some low-budget police show. One carried a clipboard. Another had a camera hanging around his neck and was already recording before anyone had even spoken. They walked straight past the private property no trespassing sign bolted into a 100-year-old oak. My cousin Danny was down near the cabin, loading hunting equipment into the truck. According to Danny, the leader was a heavy-set man named Roy Kessler. He introduced himself with the confidence of someone who had rehearsed his speech beforehand. He looked around and announced, "This trail falls within Ridgemont Estates common land easement. You folks need to vacate immediately, or we'll be forced to file a formal violation." Danny stared at him. He told Kessler that this wasn't Ridgemont land. It never had been. Kessler didn't even bother listening. Instead, he raised the clipboard in front of him like it was a search warrant and announced that the HOA board had authorized patrols to protect community boundaries from illegal hunting activity. But here's the part that should have immediately exposed the whole thing. Ridgemont Estates HOA didn't have a security patrol. It never had. There was no security patrol line item in the HOA budget, no ordinance, no legal authority, nothing that gave them the right to enforce anything beyond their own properly platted lots. These men weren't HOA employees. They weren't off-duty police officers. They were 4 residents who had apparently decided to appoint themselves judge, jury, and property line enforcement officers, armed with nothing more than laminated clipboards and an unbelievable amount of arrogance. Grandpa climbed down from the tree stand slowly. His rifle was broken open and safely slung over his shoulder. Then he walked toward them without saying a word. The moment Grandpa got close, Kessler puffed himself up. He claimed the patrol had every right to remove trespassers from community-adjacent recreational corridors. It was one of those phrases that sounded official but meant absolutely nothing legally. Grandpa looked at him and asked one simple question. "You got a badge, or you got a fantasy?" That's when the atmosphere changed. One of the other men stepped forward, keeping his hand near his belt as if he desperately wanted everyone to notice the taser clip there. He told Grandpa that this land would eventually be annexed into the development anyway. They were simply getting ahead of the paperwork. Translation: they wanted the hunting trail gone before future homeowners started complaining about hearing gunshots from their brand new backyards. Grandpa didn't raise his voice. He never does. He simply looked at them and said, "Y'all drove through 2 gates to get here. Both of them were closed for a reason." Kessler laughed. He told the man holding the camera to keep recording everything for evidence. Then he threatened Grandpa one more time. If Grandpa didn't cooperate, they would come back with the sheriff. What none of those men realized was that while they were standing there posturing on the ridge trail, Danny had quietly driven back down toward the property entrance. Years earlier, Grandpa had installed remote-controlled gates after a series of coyote problems. Danny activated the closures. Both gates swung shut, then the locks engaged. Heavy chain-link gates, padlocked, and there was no keypad access from the inside. 4 grown men wearing tactical vests were now standing on 42 acres of private property with absolutely no vehicle access to get themselves back out. And here's where things get really interesting. Roy Kessler and his self-appointed HOA patrol squad had just managed to trap themselves on a stranger's private land, miles away from the nearest development, with no idea what Grandpa was about to do next. Service, with an armed 74-year-old landowner standing between them and their freedom. And Grandpa was just getting started. Stay with me, because what happened next eventually made local news. Grandpa didn't threaten them. He didn't need to. He simply explained as calmly as ever that the gates were locked, cell service on the ridge was practically non-existent, and the only working phone line was inside his cabin, which he had absolutely no intention of letting them use anytime soon. "Y'all wanted to enforce boundaries," he said. "Well, these are mine, and you're standing inside them." Kessler's confidence cracked almost immediately. He demanded that Grandpa open the gate. Grandpa reminded him that trespassing charges were still very much on the table, and that he would be completely within his rights to call the actual sheriff's department himself whenever he felt like making the quarter-mile walk back to the cabin. The 4 men spent nearly 40 minutes arguing among themselves. They pulled out their phones repeatedly, searching for a signal that simply wasn't there. Meanwhile, Grandpa sat comfortably on his tailgate, eating a sandwich like a man with absolutely nowhere else to be. He wasn't holding them hostage. The gate wasn't blocking a public road, and Grandpa made certain to explain that on the camera the patrol had been recording with, he simply wasn't in any hurry to make their problem his priority. Eventually, he radioed Danny and told him to bring the real sheriff's deputy he'd already called when the SUVs first came rolling up the private drive. Grandpa had been thinking 3 steps ahead the entire time. The locked gate wasn't punishment. It was evidence. It was proof that these men had knowingly driven through closed gates and entered private property without permission. About 20 minutes later, Deputy Marsh finally arrived. Since Grandpa's spare key was, conveniently, misplaced for a little while longer, the deputy had to use a bolt cutter to get through the second gate himself. Then he walked over to the 4 men. He took one look at the laminated clipboard, then the tactical vests, then the crookedly attached HOA security decal stuck to the rented SUVs. And he asked Kessler essentially the same question Grandpa had asked earlier. "You got a badge, or is this cosplay?" That was when the entire story started falling apart. Roy Kessler wasn't even a member of the Ridgemont Estates HOA board. He was simply a regular homeowner who had appointed himself the head of a neighborhood watch initiative, and the actual HOA board had never approved it. They hadn't funded it, they hadn't authorized it, and certainly hadn't given him permission to leave the subdivision and trespass onto private property a mile away while pretending to have official authority. Deputy Marsh documented everything: the vests, the fake-looking decals, the clipboard containing written violations against property over which the men had absolutely no jurisdiction. Kessler tried to explain the entire incident away as a misunderstanding involving property lines. That excuse lasted about 5 seconds, because Grandpa's original survey documents had been framed on the cabin wall since 1961. The boundaries were unmistakable. There was no confusion. There never had been. Trespassing citations were issued to all 4 men. Kessler received an additional warning regarding impersonating a security authority because the deputy noted that the vests and vehicle decals were clearly designed to make people believe they had official authority. Depending on the circumstances, that could potentially cross into criminal impersonation territory, but the best part was still sitting silently in the woods. Grandpa's trail camera near the second gate had captured almost the entire 90-minute standoff in crystal clear daylight. Kessler's threats with the clipboard, the intimidation involving the taser clipped to one man's belt, their arguments, their repeated attempts to get cell service, and finally 4 grown men pacing back and forth along a locked fence line like they had somehow wandered straight into the consequences of their own decisions. That footage would later be submitted as evidence, and eventually it would be shared right here on this channel. Word spread through Ridgemont Estates almost instantly. Once residents discovered that Kessler had been running a rogue patrol while pretending to have HOA authority, the actual HOA board called an emergency meeting. Residents were furious. They had never authorized a private patrol. They certainly hadn't authorized anyone to drive onto private land and threaten an elderly landowner with a taser visibly clipped to his belt. Kessler resigned from every community committee he'd ever joined. 2 of the other 3 men involved eventually sold their homes and moved away within the following year. Small towns have long memories, and so do neighbors whose property lines have been crossed. Grandpa never filed a lawsuit. He didn't need to. He got something much better. The Sheriff's Department now has Ridgemont Estates' official HOA contact information permanently on file, along with a specific notation stating that the HOA has no authorized security patrol and no jurisdiction beyond the subdivision's legal boundaries. Any future incident involving those boundaries will be treated as trespassing from the moment someone crosses the gate. And the hunting trail? It's still there. 3 generations of boot prints have now been joined by a 4th, my own kids, following Grandpa down that same trail every October, just like clockwork. Grandpa still tells the story exactly the same way every time, usually while chewing on something, just like he was that afternoon when those 4 men thought they were in charge. He always reaches the same line. Y'all wanted to enforce boundaries. Then he smiles. So I gave them one they couldn't argue with. If you think fake authority always gets away with it, you clearly haven't met people like my grandfather. And next week's story involves a forged HOA letter, a fake foreclosure notice, and a grandmother who fought back with nothing but a filing cabinet. Subscribe to HOA Revenge Stories so you don't miss it.